Okay, so now this material will appear on your second exam. So we're uh, we're moving ahead, and I hope that you start to find this a little bit easier to relate to. We still talk about a lot of structures, obviously, but we're starting to get to more relatable things in cells and molecules. So as we move through the organization of life, I said because your book is really is really structured to do that. You know, chapter 2 being the atoms and molecules, and chapter 3 the cells. We now take a bunch of cells, right, with a common function, right, a common purpose, and we get tissues. So the really cool thing is that you actually only have a total of 4 types of tissues. So you have hundreds of different types of cells, but they are going to be organized into, again, what we consider one of 4, right? Here on this one, you're looking at some epithelium. In fact, this is some abnormal one here, so cancerous tumors, and here's a normal, nicely organized epithelium. And you're going to learn epithelium is also first contact, so I always tell students, you can always identify epithelium because it's right next to open spaces, like here, here, and here. So, because it's either going to be opening to the outside world like your skin, or it's going to be lining some tube inside your body, which that tube would then carry something, if it's respiratory or digestive, carry something from the outside world, right, first contact, into the body. All right? So, the tissues, again, comprised of 2 or more different types of cells that have a common function. All right? And we talk about epithelium, like it shows here. We talk about connective. We talk about muscle. And we talk about nervous. All right? So those are your 4 types. All right? So here, these tissues, again, we left off in chapter 3 talking about, the origin of you, basically, from the totipotent stem cells, right? That zygote that then divided and divided and divided. And finally, when there were enough cells, about a week after you were conceived, the cells could start to organize into different functional tissues that we refer to as, right, like they show here. They call them the germ layers, the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. All right? And from those 3 germ layers that occur in the structure we call a gastrula, you will see, right, all the stuff that you now have, right? So it turns out, because of the way you develop as a flat bunch of cells that then fuse into a tube. So the cells that are kind of considered superficial, right, or on the outside, are the ecto, and meso's in the middle, and endo's inside. And that's the way it still is to this day. So the stuff that you think of on the outside of you, that came from ectoderm. The stuff that's in the middle, right, muscles and bones and blood, right? And then the endo is basically a lot of these epithelial cells and glands that line the very inside of your body. So it's a really cool idea. That you'll explore a little bit more when you go on into A&P 2 at the very end. So, again, this is just, how did you become organized? How did we get to all these tissues? So, we produced a whole lot of cells, and the cells began to turn on and off different genes, which allowed them then to take on different shapes and different functions. All right? So, it's pretty cool. And this is a nice picture that gives you this idea of the 4 major types and some examples of it as we go through this chapter. All right, so we have to talk about tissue membranes as well. So these tissues are eventually going to be, right, organized into organs, right? That's going to be our next level up, and organs into organ systems. So in order to keep everything organized, which was a characteristic of life that we introduced in chapter 1, we do a lot of compartmentalization, right? And you got that feeling when we talked about cavities and, in various spaces, and serous membranes, right? We already talked about that. Well, we have to add a few more in here. And again, tissue membranes, because they're surrounding these structures and they're made of these different tissues. And so we want to compare and contrast. There are basically 4 types to show you here: mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous, and synovial. And again, serous we really already talked about. And they are going to cover cavities, tubes, right, and structures, and some of them work to protect you, like the mucous membranes, give you a little green for snot, right, pretty cool, huh? And serous is blue because they're watery. Cutaneous, your skin isn't purple, but the cutaneous is, of course, the skin. And then synovial is really what we find in our joints, right, so it's unique to joint cavities. right? So here again, nice diagram. Mucous membranes will be epithelial, but a different type of epithelial from serous, right? And cutaneous will be a different type of epithelium. And then I said, so all these membranes have in common, the mucous, serous, and cutaneous, is that they are comprised of epithelial and connective tissues, not muscles and not nerve, all right? And this walks you through some of the ideas of what each of these membranes are. The synovial is an outlier because it is actually only connective tissue, and we find this in the joints exclusively, whereas we find serous membranes kind of scattered in the ventral body cavity, right, the thoracic and abdominal pelvic. We see mucous membranes really in a lot of places. They line all the tracts of the body, and we'll talk a lot about those throughout the courses. All right. So again, this just goes back and talks about each of these membranes. The mucous membrane, again, lines the cavities that open to the outside world, right? Your digestive tract, your respiratory tract, your genital tract, right? It's anything that is going to have access, and so they're built to protect you, right? And they're built to allow, right, some passage, but controlled passage, as we talked about that control at length when we talked about the cell and did the molecular movement in lab. So I say it can be a variety of epithelial cells. It really depends on your need. But epithelium, as you're going to learn, what all epithelial tissue does to some extent is it has the ability to secrete, absorb, and protect. And then the different types will do these functions to some more or less different degrees. But this is the general, right, function of epithelium. All right? So they usually have mucous glands associated with them. Oh, there's a surprise, right? So these mucous glands and goblet cells, so mucous glands can be a collective of a bunch of cells. A goblet cell is actually just one cell. And they secrete, again, a substance called mucus, which is a sugary protein, basically, that has a protective factor. And it helps to coat and protect. So serous membranes, again, here's that old familiar, right, picture. We have the two layers to it on the pericardium, the pleural, right and left, and then the peritoneal. Now the serous membranes, of course, are very, very thin, simple squamous epithelium. So very, very delicate with just some loose connective tissue we call loose areolar. And they're all inside the body. They don't have to protect you. They generally are not letting things in and out. They are really wrapping around these structures and reducing friction and allowing them to prevent inflammation while they're all moving. They do have a little bit of fluid, again, but it's really they're there to basically prevent damage. So I say they're kind of equivalent to kind of a saran wrap almost. All right. And then again, the cutaneous, we have a whole chapter on skin, and the synovial, we have a whole chapter on joints. So starting with epithelium, and this is good because, like I said, epithelium is found, it's first contact, so it's a good place to start. It's the outside of your body, it's all the tubes inside your body, and it varies, right? So we're going to talk about different types of epithelium, okay? So they generally have little extracellular material, right? So here, again, what you're seeing, these round structures are nuclei, right? And you can't see it very well, but here's the cell here, next to this cell here, next to this cell, etc. So the cells are very tightly organized. So again, they're first contact, so nothing is going to pass. No bacterium, no microbes are going to pass between the cells. Now, most of the cells have a free surface, sometimes called a luminal or apical, because this, right, if it's a tube, the opening in the tube is called a lumen. So again, here's where stuff from the outside world might be, or if this is a gland, it'd be where these cells would make something and secrete it into this space. But you know epithelium because it's right next to some open space, right? And then they have a basement membrane. So oftentimes this is dark line. The basement membrane is also a sugary protein. It's kind of adhesive proteins that help to organize and allow the epithelium to stay in place. And so in this here, that's the basement membrane right there, right? So here's our apical surface, here's our basal surface or basolateral. Other things about epithelium, all right? Again, absorb, protect, secrete. That's their jobs. They are first contact, which means they are avascular. A means without or none. They don't have blood vessels. Sorry, I misspelled that. That A shouldn't be there. All right, I just realized. So, but they don't. This is the epithelium, and there aren't any blood vessels in all of this. This is the epithelium, no blood vessels. There's blood vessel right underneath it, but not within the tissue. This is also protective, because if something's going to try to invade the body, it's going to try to get into the blood. So if our tissue of first contact has no blood vessels in it, that's kind of a safety mechanism if you think about it, right? Epithelium is also mitotically active, right? So because it's first contact, it undergoes a lot of wear and tear. And so if I'm not able to replace these cells when they're damaged, then pretty soon I would end up with an open wound, and I would have access to the blood, and of course I would die from a secondary infection, from an ulceration unable to heal would be the result, and I would be susceptible to infection. So epithelium stays very active. This again is why many of the cancers that we look at are epithelial in origin. Because remember, the cancers are the result of cells that have a mutated cell cycle, and they just keep going and going and going. All right, they cover the external and internal surfaces, and because they're secrete, they form most glands. Okay, so we want to point this out, since we need to organize a bunch of cells together to make a tissue and get them to cooperate with a similar function. We do talk about these junctions, right? You see junction in all three of these. And here's the cartoons for this. So junctions, a joining of these. So tight junctions are what we really saw on the previous slide, right? These are tight junctions. There's very little space between this. These are actual proteins, and so it almost functions like a zipper to hold these two cells. This is one cell membrane next to its neighboring cell membrane. Anchoring junctions are like reinforcement, basically. When you have a tissue that's going to be stretched or pulled, or an organ, the tissue in an organ that's going to be stretched or pulled in some way, like the heart or the stomach or skin, right? You would put some anchoring. We refer to these often as desmosomes, also adherens. Adhering means you're sticking to something. So these are proteins that move through, and it's like reinforced stitching between this cell and this cell. And then gap junctions, right, which are shown up here, right? The gap junctions are actually channels between two cell membranes, and they allow very small things from this cell to move directly into this cell. And so this is often used for electrical excitivity, right? If I want to really move an electrical change, ions, quickly, I will have gap junctions between cells. All right, so types of epithelium. All right, what are the subtypes of this? So all of these, what we're going to talk about here, falls into the category of epithelium. I said usually you see two names to describe them, and they're based on the shape of the cell and the number of cell layers. Okay, well, the cool thing about the number of cell layers is you either have one layer and they're therefore simple, or you have more than one and you're stratified. Right, strata is layers. For shape, you basically fall into one of these four, and these are the most common. Squamous, and that means scale. Cuboidal, because, yeah, look at that, you're a cube, right? Columnar, because you're a big rectangle. Or pseudo, falsely layered. So, and we'll talk more about it as we get into that, but that's your shapes that we could discuss, all right? So here's our simple squamous, all right? A single layer of thin, flat, scale-like cells. So here I'm looking down on them. Here I'm looking at them from the side. See how very thin. This is the nucleus, and this is the cell, right? Nucleus and cell. I mean, these are, here's also an example right here. So here's our basement membrane under this one. So just really very, very flat, thin cells. No, this wouldn't be a very good barrier, right? You don't have very far to go from whatever's out here to in here, because that's actually a capillary there, right? Where do you find this? You find this in places that you want diffusion to occur, right? I mean, if you need to move something rapidly, well, this isn't very far to go. So here in the lungs, right, lining all these little structures we call alveoli, is simple squamous. And so oxygen moves in from the lungs to the blood rapidly, all right? The structure means the tissue is good at filtration or diffusion, as I said. It can be used to prevent abrasions between organs, so this is part of our serous membrane as well. Okay?